Our final paper for this panel is by Dr. Yasser Morsi, who is a postdoc at the University of South Australia, International Center for Muslim and Non-Muslim Understanding. Dr. Morsi's talk is The Hollow Subject of Islamophobia.
Assalamu alaikum. Firstly, thank you for inviting me, and hopefully it's been a great start, and hopefully I can contribute to the conversation. Please let me know if I'm louder. Yeah, I get that often. Okay, so that nothing is more confusing than the Muslim as a subject of the West. And in a sense, my debate here is, how do we begin to imagine the Muslim as a target of Islamophobia? What do we mean by the Muslim as a subject of Islamophobia? Halliday's principal argument is, of course, that Islamophobia carries with it, he puts the term Islam in quotation marks because it's incapable of expressing and carrying an expression of the diversity of the Muslim world and the varied types of Muslim subjectivities and the varied types of ethnicities, identities, and places that Muslims hold within that Muslim world. And subsequently, the term Islamophobia, rather than bring into visibility the diversity of that world, actually does the very thing it purports to do opposite. It essentializes, generalizes, and brings into view a singular, monolithic Eastern religious other. So out of Halliday, although I will come to the reasons why I disagree, but out of Halliday I think we can derive a particular question. And that question is, as I started out, who exactly do we as scholars, both identifying and highlighting what Islamophobes do, and registering anti-Islamophobic literature, what is it that we mean by Muslim? For example, can one be an Islamophobe towards Osama bin Laden? Can one be Islamophobic towards ISIS? So much of our discussion is, I suggest, that the Muslim is a form of victim towards Islamophobia, where it has been fossilized, generalized, brought into characterization as according to a negative set of qualities. Colonialism is about constructing the Muslim threat, but it is also about the construction of native informants. The good-bad binary has been done and it's been understood. And I remember, I think it was around 2005, I was in Singapore, pursuing that question, what is the Muslim subject of Islamophobia? How do we understand it? I went to, I think it was an exhibition on Islamic science in Singapore. It was called the Sultans of Science. It was a celebration of Muslim history of Islamic sciences. We discovered astronomy, invented coffee, what we contributed to the West, and the tide line of how Islam was really the birth of the Renaissance and so forth. And one particular display caught my attention. It was of a mannequin of 12th century philosopher and thinker, Imam Ghazali. He was standing there with thobe, turban, very exotic turban, synthetic beard, had a frown on his face as if in crisis, continually, searching for the deliverance from error. And instantly, while staring at this peculiar object, a spotlight came on, and audio came on, and as if to say the mannequin came to life, Ghazali began to speak. I'll never forget because it spoke with a touch of an Arabic accent, right? As if to give it a sense of authenticity. And Ghazali was reciting passages from Deliverance of Error. And anybody who knows the book will know the story of Ghazali tormented by crisis and taking a journey to find submission through God as a solution. But this passage is taken out of a moment where Ghazali was in contemplation about what it constitutes to speak as a religious subject, and how he rejects masters and guardians. In a sense, as a philosophy student, listening to this mannequin, he sounded more like Immanuel Kant. He sounded like Kant from the essay, What is the Enlightenment? Rejecting the guardian, speaking of the docile creatures who are under the myth of superstition. And I could not help but think, right here is what I want to say about the subject of Islamophobia. It is indeed an object, one with essentialized exotic form, but one with a de-essentialized hollow content. that allows it to carry a Westernese voice. That is to say, the spotlight brings into attention the very Muslim that can be narrated for, even if it uses Ghazali's own text. It is framed within a narrative that celebrates here a sense of Western universalism or a Kantian subject. In the sense, Kant's main point of Enlightenment, if I may summarize very quickly, don't tell the philosophy department, but there's a sense of a transcendental subject that has escaped its tradition, escaped its superstition, and hovers somewhere above to be able to critique. And it's through that one sense of individuality is created, and one sense of capacity to critique. Freedom is a presupposition to reason. So this mannequin became as if an archetypical, if you will, analogy that I wanted to pursue. It was something akin to Said's argument in Orientalism, where the East becomes nothing more, if you will, than the background upon which we derive a Western story. In around 2011, you may all know the story, but there was a controversy around that hit global media about a blog called Gay Girl in Damascus. The Guardian spoke about the bravery of the blogger Amina Arif, who wrote about her ordeals in challenging the patriarchy and the Arab world at the time of an uprising in Syria. She wrote about her revolutionary spirit, how she could not leave Syria, and spoke about the intimacy, the details of what it's like to grow up as a lesbian Arab American in Syria during this political upheaval. There were humorous moments, sad moments, moments where she has to confront her father about her sexuality, and there are other moments when she speaks of her delight in finding a salon full of other gay women. The only problem with Amina Arif, as you may all know, is that Amina was actually Tom McMaster, a 40-year-old white American male studying in the UK, pretending to be Amina. What's more interesting is the global reaction. She was celebrated in The Guardian of all places as a voice of the people, as a champion of the cause. And eventually when Tom McMaster got caught, he gave a very interesting explanation. He was fighting Islamophobia, if you will. He was fighting Orientalism. He was attempting to tell the West, remove your ignorant veil and see the voice behind the curtain. You will focus on the Arab, but you have to listen to the story. The sheer audacity of believing he had an intimacy with the Arab world is part and parcel of that Orientalist tradition. I know that world. What was more interesting is, well, the story that he gives to Amina's demise. She was eventually, typically, of course, captured by Syrian forces who kidnapped her, and the detail in the final blog is he invents a cousin who writes on the behalf of Amina, and they describe this scene where she's pulled away, hand on her mouth, pushed into a kind of dusty red car which has Bashir Assad stickers on it. The detail, brilliant. And it captured everybody. There was outrage. I think Facebook page was open, Free Amina, hashtag Free Amina. 10,000 people came in. And what was interesting in noting and looking at the space upon which this Free Amina page operated, everybody was invested in rescuing Amina. And here this analogy, I think, works because the Muslim at the heart here doesn't have to be real. And this is where Halliday gets it tragically wrong. Islamophobia is not dependent on the reality of the Muslim. It is dependent on the fiction, if you will, a mannequin upon which is constituted for everybody to have a conversation about how to rescue the Muslim or how to demonize the Muslim. What the Muslim is, and the categories that we can list, is somewhat irrelevant. Now, this is somewhat of a work in progress, so I haven't conceptually and theoretically worked this out, but what I'm trying to say is here, the Muslim as a mannequin, as a hollow object, there's something a bit like Lacan's objectivity art. And I'll try and work through this. What I mean by this, it is a symptom of what is missing. So if we go back to the mannequin, what's really interesting about here is what's being constituted is the sense of a Western universal voice. I mean, it attracts audiences to the idea that our voice speaks through Ghazali. It reconstitutes the idea of a wholeness. And to give you an example of a debate that we've probably all heard time and time again, is this debate of Muslims lacking the capacity to integrate into liberal societies, and if only they integrated, things would be better off for them. So we hear about the threat of Muslims as isolation, and the categories that Franks bring up are perfect here. Yeah, if only they ate properly and dressed properly and spoke properly and so forth. And if democracy affords them the capacity to do this, well, what if the fantasy is precisely that? The very idea of speaking about the Muslim on the fringe allows us to imagine that democracy has the capacity to accommodate difference. The Muslim allows us to imagine here as a hollow object that if only it did what it did, then democracy would work. In that object petit a, it is the object that allows us, that drives the fantasy of that which is missing. A bit like, forgive me for a ridiculous analogy, but I'm doing this for my sake to work it through. It's like when I tell myself the reason why I don't go to the gym is because I've got no car, right? And at the moment I get a car, I still don't go to the gym, right? But the car here as a conceptual object works for me to fantasize that if it was there, I'd be all buff, right? I'd be working out right now, okay? Yeah. And I want to say that the racialized object works in the liberal fantasy in the same way, yeah? If only they did this and that, we would be here and there. And a lot of us are seduced by this conversation, yeah? And sometimes that object has changed. If only the Islamists weren't around, then East and West would meet. If only Muslims would recognize their own problems, then there would be peace in the Middle East, right? And that's part of, I think, the underlying fantasy of Islamophobia. And it is precisely that it has really, as I read it, absolutely nothing to do with Muslims. With one clause, to go back to the mannequin, although it is about the appropriating of the Muslim set of commodities, imageries, beads, hijabs, words, sharia, halal, jihad, etc. What the Muslim is not of its own history. And to return back to Ghazali, I mean this, let's go back to that passage from Deliverance from Error. Anybody who's familiar with the book, and I'll run very quickly through it, Ghazali is struck by a crisis of his time. He does not know how to, if you will, speak as a religious subject. He believes his environment of his time is corrupted by the repetition of religious norms that misses its essential spirit. And he goes into a kind of 11-year walk, right? He goes to escape, to isolation. He targets 4 different forms of the religion, but he is at a crossroad. And the poetry and the poetics of his autobiography is speaking about a man who loses a sense of self, struck by silence, right? And at this crossroads, he does not know where he is or who he is, and essentially what it means to be a Muslim. It is only eventually when he concludes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala struck light into his heart, that it was the way of the Sufi, that is the way of affect, the way of body, the way of embodiment, not the way of conceptualization, that he realized that Islam is about a relationship with God. Now, I want to make this point, and I have to be very careful. It is not my intent or purpose to essentialize in any shape or form the Muslim, but at the same time, I'm worried about colonialism's de-essentializing of the Muslim. And I will say this in a sense of a Bedouin notion of the term. The Muslim as a category is one that comes out of the event of the Quran. And by the event of the Quran, I simply mean this, that which inevitably tells a story about God. Now, we do not have to echo that story. We do not have to belong to that story, but the term Muslim inevitably has a relationship with it. And what I want to mean by the hollow object here is, to use the analogy of a frame, and I thought the example of terrorism framing our conversations, is that the hollow object is the imagery of a Muslim outside of the event. its own event, its own coordinates, its own world, what Said called its worldliness, its own history. It is a conversation that is continually carrying the voice of the Westernese, be that the voice of a universality, be that the voice of our incapacity and wholeness. It is precisely an object that drives the fantasy of whatever political desire the West may have. One that may reconstitute multiculturalism, one that may reconstitute nationalism, or one that may reconstitute a threat. Either way, to answer Halliday, I would say, as a starting premise, and a lot of this is me working through it, is that the Muslim subject of Islamophobia is a hollow object that drives the conversations the West wishes to have about itself. And a response to this then is to escape the frame, to no longer speak as if we are an observed thing, but in that Ghazalian sense, to speak as observers of the West. Thank you very much.